On the mist-covered shores of Windmere, where the scent of salt lingers with the sound of waves, a warm, amber-coated German shepherd named Nico walks faithfully beside Leo, his steadfast friend and partner. But when the town's peace is torn apart by the mysterious disappearance of children, Nico's sharp eyes and unwavering instincts become its only hope. Each paw print pressed into the damp sand leads him deeper into the fog, closer to a secret hidden in the harbor, one that could change everything. Mornings in Windmere always carried the scent of salt from the sea, mingled with a crisp northern breeze. The small town rested quietly along the curve of a crescent-shaped bay, its edges guarded by dark green ridges of pine. White and blue wooden houses lined the coastal road, their moss-covered roofs exuding a kind of warmth that felt as if they had stood there for generations. The sound of waves breaking against the rocky shore blended with the cries of gulls, creating a familiar backdrop that made Windmere both gentle and faintly timeless. Here people knew each other by name, by the smile exchanged in the morning, and by the small stories traded while queuing for bread at Mrs. Harriet's bakery. Children still ran barefoot along the sand, even as the wind grew colder this season, while the adults gathered at the cafe near the harbor, warming their hands on steaming mugs as they spoke of the day's catch or news from the mainland. Perhaps it was that closeness that wove an invisible thread between them, all binding the town like one large family. Leo Turner lived at the far end of the coastal road, in a small wooden house facing the mist-veiled bay. Once a firefighter, he had known the weight of tense shifts and life-or-death moments, until a serious injury ended his service. He returned to Windmere, the place where he had grown up, to find a slower rhythm. Though firefighting was now behind him, the instinct to respond, to protect, still lay in every breath he took. Living with him was Nico, a German shepherd with an amber coat that shimmered in warm golden-brown tones, sable shading across his back and eyes that were always bright ears, always alert. Nico had come into Leo's life 3 years earlier, fresh from completing his service training. From the first meeting, Leo had seen the intelligence and quiet perception behind the dog's strong frame. They quickly fell into a shared rhythm, as if they had been partners far longer than the calendar claimed. That morning, a pale fog still clung to the sea, draping a thin white veil over the horizon. Leo stepped onto the porch in a thick coat, steam curling from the coffee cup in his hand. Nico waited at the steps, tail swaying gently, eyes fixed on the long stretch of sand ahead. When Leo set the cup down to clip on the lead, Nico lifted his head, a silent spark of anticipation in his gaze, the kind only those truly close could recognize. They began their familiar walk along the shoreline. The cold wind flushed color into Leo's cheeks, while Nico's steady stride left clear prints in the damp sand. Every so often he paused to breathe in the scent of the sea and the wet wood of moored boats before continuing at Leo's side. Along that path, words weren't needed. They spoke in a language of absolute trust. Near the harbor, Leo stopped to exchange a few words with Mr. Baker, who was repairing a fishing net. Nico sat close, patient, scanning every movement around them. A boy ran up from the distance, a rubber ball clutched in his hands. Nico tilted his head, tracking him. When the boy tossed the ball toward the water, Nico glanced briefly at Leo as if asking permission, then bounded forward in long, sure strides, splashing through the shallow surf to retrieve it. He returned with the ball in his jaws, his damp fur catching the muted light, earning the boy's laughter and Leo's quiet smile. The road home curved up along the hillside, revealing Windmere in full clustered rooftops, chimney smoke curling into the air and beyond the sea, shimmering in silvery blue. Leo slowed his pace, letting Nico investigate the shrubs along the way. Each time Nico looked back at him, his gaze seemed to be listening to something beyond words, a connection that defied simple description. Back at the house, Leo hung his coat and filled Nico's water bowl. The dog drank, then wandered to his spot on the rug by the window where he liked to rest and watch the outside world. Leo sat at his small desk unfolding the area map, a habit carried from his firefighting days, and marked the paths they had walked that week. It wasn't for duty anymore, just a quiet wish to remember the places they had shared. Outside, the wind still carried the tang of the sea and the hush of waves. Peace filled the little home, yet beneath that calm, something seemed to wait. From his place by the window, Nico's gaze shifted toward the line of old shipping containers at the far end of the docks, where the fog hung thicker than usual. Leo didn't notice, but Nico's eyes fixed the spot, as if making a silent note, a quiet reminder that some journeys only appear to begin. That morning the fog was so dense the sea and sky seemed to merge, divided only by the silver break of the waves. Fishing boats stayed moored, their lanterns casting a faint glow over the milk-colored water. Cold wind rushed down the stone-paved streets, carrying the scent of salt and damp wood. Leo sat at the kitchen table, coffee still steaming in his hands. Nico lay beside him, head resting on his leg, ears twitching now and then at the call of a gull. The stillness lasted only a few minutes before an urgent knock broke through. When Leo opened the door, Mrs. Harriet, the bakery owner and longtime neighbor, stood there, breath quick and face pale with worry. "Leo, it's the Elliott boy. He's gone missing." Her voice trembled. The words struck cold. The Elliott family lived only a few streets away. Their son Thomas was 10 years old, gentle, always ready to help his parents at their small shop. Harriet explained that while delivering bread that morning, she'd heard the sound of Thomas's mother crying. The boy had gone out to play the afternoon before and never returned. The family had searched all night, but by dawn, there was still no trace. Leo grabbed his coat, motioning for Nico to follow. They moved quickly to the Elliott home, where a small group of neighbors stood, gathered faces drawn with worry. Thomas's mother sat on the steps, eyes red, her hands gripping a worn handkerchief. His father stood nearby, speaking to 2 uniformed officers, his voice hoarse. Chief McKenna stepped forward as soon as he spotted Leo. "We've already checked the beach and the northern forest. No sign of him. It's possible the boy wandered toward the abandoned industrial zone, but we're widening the search." His gaze lingered briefly on Nico. "We may need your friend's nose for this." Before anyone could speak, another woman came hurrying in. Mrs. Carter, who owned the grocery store on the west side of town. Breathless, she blurted out, "My daughter Lily hasn't come home since last night. I thought she stayed over at a friend's, but when I called, no one knew where she was." A heavy silence fell over the gathering, like a cold wind sweeping through. Leo could feel the tension tighten. 2 children missing in the same time frame was no ordinary matter. Then another couple arrived, their faces drawn in panic. They had been searching for their son Sam since the night before. Within less than an hour, word spread across Windmere. The number of missing children kept climbing. First 3, then 7, then 12. By mid-morning, the list had grown to 15 names. Each family told a different story, yet one detail remained the same. The last sighting had been the afternoon before in different spots around town. No one had noticed anything unusual, no cry for help. It had all happened so quietly that no one realized until it was far too late. The once peaceful air of Windmere now lay under a heavy shadow. Mrs. Harriet's bakery closed early, and the harbor cafe stood hushed. Adults whispered to one another, eyes darting around for any sign of danger. Children were told to stay indoors, the front doors bolted tight. Leo joined the emergency meeting at the town hall. The small room glowed under yellow light, which only deepened the tension on every face. A large map of Windmere lay spread across the table, red pins marking where each child had last been seen. They were scattered with no clear pattern, making it harder to predict a lead. Chief McKenna assigned teams 1 to sweep the northern forest, another to search the abandoned industrial zone, and a third to comb through the harbor and the old storage warehouses. Leo volunteered for the harbor team. a place he knew by heart where Nico could easily pick up any unusual scent. Before leaving, Leo took a moment to look around. Faces were tight with worry, but behind it was a steady resolve. In Windmere, people stood together when it mattered. The situation might be uncertain, but no one here would walk away. They split off in their assigned directions, the fog still heavy and unbroken. Leo and Nico made their way down the stone path to the docks. The waves pounded against the shore deep and steady, like the sea's own sigh. Nico moved beside Leo, lowering his nose to the ground at intervals, breathing deep, then lifting his head to scan their surroundings. His stride was calm, but his sharp eyes burned with a rare focus. At the docks, rows of rust-streaked containers emerged from the mist. Leo noticed Nico's gaze fixed on the far end, where the oldest containers stood in an unused corner. He was about to head that way when a call came from the search team requesting help at warehouse number 3. Turning back, Leo saw Nico glance once more toward those weathered containers as if committing them to memory. By noon, the harbor team returned empty-handed. More bad news came in. None of the other groups had found any solid leads. Families of the missing children waited in the hall, eyes fixed on the door, their faces lined with worry. The room was thick with silence, broken only by the wind outside and the scratch of pen on paper as officers logged reports. Leo sat by the window, his hand resting lightly on Nico's head. The dog leaned into his leg gaze, still locked on the fog beyond, as though waiting for a signal only he could sense. In that moment, Leo felt the bond between them tighten. A shared instinct telling him the search had only just begun, and the most important clue was still hidden somewhere in the dense, breathless mist of Windmere. That afternoon, the fog hung so thick it was as though the sun had never risen. The town hall's meeting room was crowded shadows pressed around the long table. A map of Windmere and its surroundings was spread wide, covered in clusters of red, blue, and yellow pins, marking searched areas and new targets. Chief McKenna stood at the head of the table, his voice low but resolute. "We're facing an emergency. 15 children missing in less than 24 hours. This has never happened in our town's history." Silence gripped the room. The faint scratch of a clerk's pen seemed louder than anything else. All eyes were fixed on the map, where the pins formed a scattered picture revealing no clear pattern. McKenna went on, "There's no sign of a struggle, no direct witnesses. We must assume the children were taken by vehicle and are likely being kept in a concealed location. The abandoned industrial park, the old warehouses at the harbor, isolated houses on the outskirts. All must be treated as high-risk sites." Leo stood toward the end of the table, listening closely. Nico sat at his side, posture's steady ears turning toward every sound in the room. To others, he might have looked like just a quiet dog, but Leo knew better. He could read the subtle shifts in Nico's stillness, the readiness, the faint tension of waiting to move. A rescue team member, Harris, spoke up. "We'll split into 3 units. Unit 1 will sweep the northern forest and abandoned rest stops. Unit 2 will check the industrial zone. Unit 3 will cover the harbor and the southern hills." Leo stepped forward without hesitation. "I'll take the harbor team. Nico will handle scent tracking and detection." McKenna nodded, no questions asked. He knew Leo's capabilities, and more importantly, the unmatched precision between him and Nico. In past rescues, Nico had found victims buried under rubble with nothing more than a single deep breath and unyielding patience. As the meeting shifted into the analysis phase, a large board was rolled forward, listing in detail the time and place each child had last been seen. Leo studied it closely, committing to memory the smallest overlaps. How many of the disappearances had happened late in the afternoon or near the roads that led toward the harbor? Nico, as if sensing his handler's focus, rose and padded closer to the map. He sniffed lightly at the marked notes, then turned back toward Leo. That look in his eyes, was like a question, or perhaps a reminder. Leo gave a faint nod, as if acknowledging that Nico's instincts were picking up on something important. The meeting stretched for over an hour. Once the plan was finalized, the teams moved quickly into preparation. Leo checked the lead clipped on Nico's reflective collar and fitted his search harness. He also packed a small pouch with dry food water and a few basic first aid supplies. On the way to the staging area, Harris, the harbor team leader, came alongside him. "You sure Nico's ready?" Leo gave a small smile. "Nico's ready before I am." Beside him, Nico stood tall, his warm golden-brown coat with sable shading catching what little afternoon light filtered through each strand of fur stirring in the salt-tinged breeze. His gaze was fixed on the direction of the harbor, as if the route was already decided. As the team moved into the search zone, Leo let Nico take the lead. The German shepherd advanced with purpose, lowering his nose close to the ground, then lifting it to draw in long breaths of air laced with 1,000 scents. The damp wood of boats, the salt of the sea, the cold tang of rusted metal. He sifted through them, discarding the familiar, seeking the one that didn't belong. Their footsteps thudded softly on the old wooden planks of the pier, the hollow sound mixing with the steady wash of waves. Harris signaled a halt at a container with its door slightly ajar, but inside was only fishing net and a few half-forgotten crates. Nico sniffed once around the perimeter, then moved on without hesitation. Leo knew that when Nico ignored something, it was because he was certain it wasn't the lead they needed. That precision had saved hours, even lives in past rescues. At the far end of the docks, the fog still hung heavy over the faded rows of containers. Nico stopped, eyes fixed on a shadowed corner where a cluster of older containers sat stacked as though forgotten. His tail gave a slight twitch, ears angled toward it, body taut. Leo was about to guide the team there when Harris's radio crackled, a call for backup at another warehouse closer to the waterfront. Harris chose to postpone the detour, promising they'd return. As they left, Nico glanced back at that corner, imprinting the spot in memory. Back at the staging point, McKenna was waiting for reports. No team had found a definitive trace, but everyone agreed the harbor warranted deeper sweeps. Leo knelt beside Nico, running a hand over his neck. The dog's gaze drifted to the window toward the faint glow of harbor lights through the fog. In that stillness, Leo felt the invisible thread between them draw tighter, a link he believed would lead them to the truth hidden in Windmere's mist. And deep down, he knew tomorrow would be a long day. The next morning, Windmere lay beneath the same thick shroud of fog. The sky was silver gray, the sea like a dim mirror disturbed only when cold gusts swept across. From far out, a ship's horn echoed, folding into the sound of hurried footsteps moving through the waking town. At headquarters, the search teams gathered quickly. McKenna outlined the day's plan. Team 1 would push deeper into the northern forest, Team 2 would sweep every abandoned warehouse in the industrial zone, and Team 3, Leo and Nico among them, would return to the old harbor and extend the search into the less frequented areas. As others readied gear, Leo crouched to check Nico's lead. The dog stood still, eyes steady as if ready since before dawn. The amber coat shimmered faintly in the weak morning light. His breathing was even, but his ears stayed in constant motion, attuned to every sound. The forest team left first. The path in was damp, carpeted with pine needles, roots twisting above the soil. Voices crackled over radios, reporting the discovery of small footprints near a clearing, later matched to searchers from the day before. Now and then a candy wrapper or bit of paper turned up, but nothing to confirm they belonged to the missing children. In the industrial zone, the second team opened one rusted metal door after another, hinges groaning. Inside was the scent of mold and dust-broken tables, rotting crates, abandoned machinery. In the corner of warehouse number 7, they found a pale blue handkerchief embroidered with the letter T. It was sent back immediately for Thomas's family to confirm, only for his mother to shake her head. not his. The trail went cold again. At the harbor, Leo and Nico moved into the cluster of old containers. The fog clung to their steel skins, streaks of rust trailing down like dried tears. Nico's pace was measured, his nose tracing the ground and drawing in the scent from narrow seams in the metal. At times, he would stop, ears pricked, eyes locked on a point, then move on, as if the pieces weren't yet enough. Leo noted every reaction, marking in his mind the spots Nico lingered on. Near a row pressed up against an old brick wall, Nico inhaled deeply through a small gap, then looked to him. Leo knelt, reaching inside to pull free a scrap of fabric, part of a child's shirt, old and smeared with machine oil. Harris recommended sending it for analysis, though they knew it might not bring a breakthrough. As Nico continued his search, Leo noticed there were few adult footprints in the area, but some smaller marks, possibly from a child's shoe. The ground was a mix of sand and scattered stone, making it impossible to tell how fresh they were, or if they belonged to the ones they sought. By noon, the teams returned to headquarters to report in. On the table lay the day's finds: the handkerchief from the warehouse, the torn scrap of cloth from the harbor, a scattering of snack wrappers from the forest, and an empty tin box. Each was numbered and labeled, but none carried enough weight to point toward a clear direction. The atmosphere in the room was both heavy and tense. McKenna stood over the map, brows furrowed his fingertips, drumming softly against the edge of the table. "We have clues, but they're scattered. We need to connect them, otherwise we'll keep running in circles." Leo listened, but his mind kept circling back to that moment when Nico had lingered longest by the row of containers against the brick wall. He couldn't explain why, but instinct told him it had been more than a passing pause. Nico rarely stopped unless the scent was strong enough to stir suspicion. When the meeting broke for a quick lunch, Leo took Nico out to the back lot for water. The sea breeze rattled a few stray pages of an old newspaper left on the bench. Nico drank a few mouthfuls, then suddenly turned his head toward the harbor, eyes locking in a focus so sharp that Leo found himself following the gaze. All he saw was the thick wall of fog and the faint silhouettes of distant containers. Leo sat down, running a slow hand along Nico's neck, feeling each measured breath. He knew their connection wasn't just about commands and responses. It was built on absolute trust. If Nico had etched that location into memory, there was a reason to return. That afternoon, the teams dispersed again. But this time, Leo had clearly marked the section Nico was interested in. He told Harris that if no solid lead came from the others by tomorrow, they would go back to that corner of the harbor and check every container one by one. As the weak light of evening faded, Windmere sank into a cold, muted gray. Yet inside Leo's chest, a small flame had been lit. Fragile, not bright enough to illuminate the path ahead, but stubborn against the dark. Nico walked beside him, stride steady, ears swiveling at the faintest sounds. Perhaps the dog was the only compass capable of guiding them to where the children were being held. And Leo knew when night passed, they would begin again, holding to the belief that even the smallest trace could be the key to the whole story. On the third day since the disappearances began, Windmere felt like another town entirely. The fog still clung to every street, but it was no longer just the cold breath of the sea. It had become a heavy curtain draped over every rooftop, every doorway. The laughter of children was gone. Shops opened late and closed early. Cafes that once bustled now held only a handful of silent patrons, clutching cups gone cold. Leo stood at the junction near the harbor, scanning the surroundings, while Nico worked patiently over the damp stone nose to the ground. The shift in the townspeople's eyes was impossible to miss, a mix of worry and exhaustion. Many had gone sleepless for nights, waiting for word from the search teams and praying for a miracle. The Elliott family, after nearly 3 days without leaving headquarters, had moved into a small restroom in the back. Thomas's mother still clutched her son's last jacket, the worn seams pressed into her fingers like the grooves of memory. His father said little, preferring to stand by the window and stare out toward the dim harbor lights in the fog. Lily's family had chosen to stay in their own home in case she found her way back. But it meant that every small sound on the street sent her mother rushing to the porch, eyes rimmed red from hope turned to disappointment. It was the same for the others. In every home with a missing child, tension sat thick in the air. At night, the lights stayed on, shadows moved quietly behind curtains. The remaining children in town were kept inside, no one daring to let them step farther than the front stoop. The strain reached beyond the families. The entire community was caught in the current of fear. Adults spoke in hushed tones, careful not to let their worry spill in front of the little ones. Conversations at the market and post office circled only around one word: search. The search teams felt the pressure too. Each morning they set out with determination, and each night they returned empty-handed, disappointment etched deeper into their faces. The maps, now riddled with colored pins, had become a tangled mess, as if the more they searched, the more questions arose. Leo could feel the weight of time. With every passing hour, the chances of finding the children safe were slipping away. No one said it aloud, but it was there in every quiet glance exchanged between searchers. Nico seemed to sense the same urgency. Instead of the measured pace of the first days, he moved faster, now more focused. When he found an unusual scent, he lingered longer, breathing deeper, as if trying to memorize it. Leo noticed that Nico rarely strayed from his side, as though he understood that now every move they made had to be exact. That afternoon, Leo stopped by the Elliott home to give Thomas's family a brief update. He kept his words simple, avoiding details that might spark fragile hope. Thomas's mother sat composed, but her hands were clasped so tightly, the knuckles whitened. "Do you think there's still a chance?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Leo met her eyes. "We'll search until there's nowhere left to search, and I believe Nico will lead us there." It wasn't quite a promise, but it was enough to soften her gaze. Nico stepped forward, resting his head gently on her knee. His eyes warm. A silent moment passed, yet it seemed to bring a flicker of warmth into these cold days. Leaving the Elliott's porch, Leo noticed figures at windows all along the street, as if the whole town was waiting not just for news from the search, but for something that might finally cut through the fog, holding Windmere hostage. That night at headquarters, McKenna called a short meeting. He announced that if no clear lead came by morning, they would launch a second sweep of the harbor and warehouses. But this time with a different approach, slower, more deliberate, leaving no corner untouched. Hearing that, a quiet surge of both worry and hope rose in Leo's chest. His thoughts went straight to the harbor corner where Nico had lingered the longest. If they went back there tomorrow, the answer might be closer than anyone realized. Night settled over Windmere in silence, broken only by the steady rhythm of waves against the shore. On the walk home, Leo let Nico move freely at his side. The dog occasionally lifted his head to draw in deep breaths, eyes glinting with alertness. To Leo, Nico was like a second heartbeat in this search. Steady, unshaken by despair, always pushing forward. Time was running thin, but the trust between them remained unbroken. And in the foggy night, both man and dog knew that with the next dawn, they would have to take a decisive step. That morning, the sky over Windmere was so dim, it was impossible to see where the sea ended and the clouds began. The damp wind from offshore carried a dense brine that seeped through clothing and chilled the skin. As the search teams prepared to leave headquarters, the first drops of rain began to fall. Light at first, then gathering in tempo, promising a heavier downpour. Leo pulled his collar high, checked Nico's lead and reflective harness. The dog stood still, ears forward, muscles drawn taut, like a bowstring waiting to release. Within minutes, the rain had soaked his warm golden-brown coat's sable markings, darkened beads of water rolling down his back in glints of muted gold beneath the pale light. The harbor team's task today was to sweep the old docks again, focusing on container rows that had not yet been searched thoroughly. Leo stuck to his plan, letting Nico lead, following closely, watching for even the smallest reaction. The rain made the ground slick, water mixed with old dust and machine oil creating a heavy metallic tang in the air. But Leo knew that for Nico's nose, these background scents were just a mask, and anything out of place would stand out sharply. They moved deeper into a row pressed against an old brick wall. Rain hammered the container roofs above, drumming like an urgent heartbeat. Nico suddenly halted, lowering his head to the ground, inhaling deeply before easing forward toward a narrow gap between two containers. His tail dipped slightly, his entire body aligned toward that opening. Leo recognized the stance instantly, the one Nico took when he caught something unusual. Leaning down, Leo shone his flashlight into the darkness. Inside, he saw only splintered wood and an old plastic crate, rainwater trickling from above and dulling the beam. He started to step closer, but Harris's voice cut through on the radio. "Leo, the East Shore team just found items that might belong to the kids. We need everyone there now." Leo glanced at Nico. The dog still stood, rooted eyes locked on the gap. For a moment, Leo felt an invisible pull toward it. But the order was clear, and the situation at the East Shore could be the breakthrough they needed. "Come on, Nico." Leo called, his voice firm, but slowed by hesitation. Nico obeyed, though, before turning fully away. He cast one last look at the gap, as if engraving it deeper into memory. By now, the rain was coming hard, stinging against their faces. The path to the East Shore was slippery water streaming along the stone-paved walkway. When they arrived, the other team members stood around a low stone wall beside them. A few items, a small red child's backpack, a pair of canvas shoes, and a plastic water bottle. There was a flurry of talk as they tried to determine whether the items belonged to any of the missing children. Several families were called to identify them. When Lily's mother arrived, she confirmed the water bottle was her daughter's, but the backpack and shoes were unfamiliar. It was a lead that carried both a spark of hope and the haze of uncertainty. The rain was relentless, soaking everyone to the skin. Harris called for a halt to preserve strength and equipment. Leo and Nico trudged back to headquarters, water pooling underfoot. Once inside, Leo led Nico to their corner of the rest area and began toweling him dry. But when his hand reached the fur at the dog's neck, Nico lifted his head toward the window, toward the container row they had passed that morning. That look made Leo pause. In his mind flashed the image of the dark gap between the containers, the rain-blurred beam of his flashlight, and Nico's unwavering focus. The feeling of having walked past something important pressed on him like a pebble trapped in a boot, small enough to ignore in the moment, but impossible to forget. Nico's instincts were rarely wrong. Perhaps in the noise of rain and the urgency of orders, he had stepped over the one clue that mattered most. That night, long after the others had gone, Leo sat alone in the map room, eyes fixed on the section of containers against the brick wall. He drew a thick red circle around the spot and wrote beside it, "Recheck. Priority." Outside, the rain whispered on, mingling with the distant sound of waves. In the quiet room, it was just Leo and Nico, and an unspoken resolve: if the weather cleared tomorrow, they would return to that place, whether or not the rest of the team agreed. The next morning, the fog still clung to the town like a heavy scarf, but the rain had stopped. The air felt cleaner, salt mingling with the damp scent of earth and old timber from the waterfront. When Leo stepped into headquarters, he found McKenna and several rescue team members speaking with a stranger, a man in a thick gray canvas coat, its hem dusted with dried earth. The man introduced himself as Harold, a resident from the outskirts, about 2 miles from the old harbor. His voice was rough, his words deliberate, each one weighed before it left his mouth. "I think I saw something the night the children went missing. But I wasn't sure at the time, so I didn't report it right away." The room fell silent, and McKenna gestured for Harold to go on. Harold explained that near midnight, on the night the children vanished, as he was returning from a late shift at the lumber mill, he'd seen a large truck parked tight against the last row of containers at the abandoned harbor. Its headlights were off, only a faint glow spilling from inside the cab. Then he'd heard the metallic slam of a container door. "Was there anyone inside the truck?" Leo asked. "I saw a figure in the driver's seat, but when I slowed to get a better look, the engine started and it pulled away toward the coastal road." The plate. I couldn't see it clearly, but I think it started with the letter H. The air in the room shifted. Not quite relief, but a pulse of energy. For the first time, they had a sighting that matched the very area Nico had marked with his attention more than once. Leo's mind flashed with images, a truck under the wet night sky. The echo of a closing container door, the same weight in the air he'd felt that rainy morning. McKenna moved fast. One team would review coastal traffic cameras from that night, filtering every truck whose plate began with H. It would take time. Meanwhile, Leo spoke up. "We should go back to the containers Harold saw. Check every inch, inside and out." The plan was approved immediately. 2 groups split off, one to coordinate with police on license data, the other, Leo, Nico, and 3 more, to return to the abandoned docks. When they arrived, thin light broke through the fog laying across the weathered metal rows. The tang of rust and salt hung thick, as if the place was trapped in an old photograph. Nico was out of the vehicle before the door shut, nose sweeping low, pausing over scents that made him slow his step. Leo tracked every reaction. They began outside, scanning the ground for tire marks. Harris crouched to point out a faint tread with large grooves, just the kind a heavy truck might leave. It led from the coastal road straight to the row of containers, fading over harder ground, where the rain hadn't held it. As they reached the final row, Nico quickened, moving straight for the narrow gap he'd fixated on days before. This time there was no radio call, no distraction. Leo let him work. The shepherd inhaled deeply, pacing to one side, then the other, before planting himself in front of a silver-blue container tail, tapping the ground once. Leo rapped his knuckles against the steel wall. The echo came back hollow, but not empty. Something in the tone was off. Harris and another teammate stepped up, prying the latch with a crowbar. When the door groaned open, a wave of damp air rolled out, carrying the scent of machine oil, rotting wood, and something lighter. The unmistakable trace of children's clothing. Inside were only a few large wooden crates and some discarded objects. But on the floor, Leo spotted a scrap of paper pressed into a dirty patch. He picked it up. It was part of a printed photo. Just enough to show the curve of a yellow shirt shoulder and a wisp of a child's hair. It went straight into an evidence bag. It wasn't confirmation, but it felt like a step closer to the truth. By late afternoon, they were back at headquarters. McKenna had new intel in the exact time frame Harold described. Only 3 trucks with plates starting in H passed the coastal cameras, and one had already been flagged in an old case involving illegal cargo. The puzzle was still missing pieces, but for Leo, this was the first real sign. The kind that could lead them to where the children were held and maybe erase the sting of having walked past the truth before. Nico lay at his feet, eyes open, ears twitching toward every hallway sound. Today hadn't ended the search, but in those eyes, Leo saw unshaken focus. From here on, each step would carry twice the weight. The next morning, fog smothered Windmere so thickly, it felt like the whole town was submerged. Every footstep along the stone road to the harbor made a muted, swallowed sound. Leo pulled his hood tight, his breath a white plume mingling with the sharp scent of salt in the air. The harbor emerged slowly, like an old memory surfacing. Rows of containers stood shoulder to shoulder, paint flaking to reveal blotches of deep rust. Some leaned at slight angles, their hinges rattling under the relentless wind. The ground was littered with gravel and shallow puddles from rains 2 days before, reflecting shards of dull silver light. There was a different kind of stillness here. The sound of waves came distant and blurred, as though muffled by invisible walls. Every step from Leo and Nico sounded hard and clean, vanishing into the thick air. They pushed deeper into the last row. The air was a mix of metal oil and brine, a smell that lingered at the back of the throat. Leo noted faint wheel tracks pressed into the damp earth ghosts of long-past deliveries. Nico moved ahead, fluid but intent. The damp had darkened his amber coat, the sable shading across his back glowing faintly where the sun's weak rays broke through the fog. Suddenly his ears shot upright, his muscles tightening in one smooth ripple. Leo knew the signal instantly. Nico had found something that wasn't part of the harbor's usual chorus. The dog stilled, lowered his nose, drew in a long breath, and then looked back at him. It wasn't restlessness in those eyes. It was sharpened, deliberate vigilance, the kind that comes when a scent carries more than just information. Leo stepped forward, resting a hand on Nico's shoulder. "Find it," he said, voice low and certain. Nico moved slowly toward a faded red container. Its paint long stripped in patches, corrosion spreading over the surface like an old web of wounds. He circled it once, pausing at a corner where the fog pooled thicker. Lowering his nose to the ground, he pawed lightly at the gravel, scattering it, until a patch of dark, damp earth showed beneath. Leo crouched, angling his flashlight close to the ground. Faint impressions dotted the soil. Shallow footprints blurred by rain, unclear whether they belonged to a child or an adult. What caught his eye more was a scrap of pale blue fabric snagged on the jagged edge of rusted steel. The cloth was fresh, its color unlike any tarp or workwear typically seen at the docks. As Leo sealed the fabric into an evidence bag, Nico's gaze stayed locked on the darkness behind the container. He drew in another deep breath, then suddenly angled his head toward the narrow gap between two containers and gave a low, short growl. Not threatening, but warning. Leo rose, shining his beam into the gap. The light reached only a few meters before being swallowed by the fog, but he could feel the cramped, cold space ahead. A gust of sea wind swept through, carrying a sharp, unfamiliar tang. Not just salt and rust, but something faintly like damp wood and old cloth shut away for too long. The radio crackled, cutting through his focus. "Leo Harris here. We've got fresh tire marks on the south end of the harbor. Might be connected." He glanced at Nico. The shepherd held his stance alert, but when Leo signaled, he moved away, slowly glancing back more than once. Leo knew that look. Once Nico fixed a location in memory, he would return if given the chance. They headed south, where the waves sounded louder and the fog began to thin. But the image of that rust-streaked red container, the scrap of pale blue cloth, and Nico's taut reaction stayed etched in Leo's mind. He couldn't yet say if it tied directly to the missing children, but instinct told him it was one of the critical pieces. And for Leo, even the smallest piece could be the key to the place where they were being held. The harbor fog drifted on as if trying to keep its secret for a little longer. But Leo knew it couldn't hide forever. Not from his eyes, and certainly not from Nico's. By late afternoon, the mist at the harbor thickened into a white curtain, wrapping itself around everything. The groan of rusted hinges came in intervals, mixing with the far-off surge of waves, creating an air that was both still and tense. Leo walked slowly between two rows of containers, eyes sweeping every narrow shadow, every corroded seam. Nico let a head pause, falling in deliberate solid steps. His warm golden-brown coat, deepened by the damp, shimmered under the silvery light. Beads of fog clung to his fur, glinting like thousands of tiny glass drops. Without warning, he froze. His ears pricked, nose dipped slightly, muscles pulled tight as a drawn bow. Before them stood a weather-faded blue-green container paint flaking in wide patches to reveal mottled gray steel. The upper edge of its doors bowed slightly inward, as though from a heavy impact. Nico planted himself in front of it, head tilted just enough to line his amber gaze with the narrow strip of dim light seeping between the doors. Leo recognized instantly that this wasn't Nico's usual curiosity over an odd scent. Normally, the dog would circle, checking from different angles. This time he stood rooted, eyes like sharpened blades, breathing slow and deep. The posture of an animal identifying a threat or something demanding absolute attention. Stepping up, Leo laid a hand on Nico's back. The shepherd's body was solid tense. "What's in there, buddy?" Leo murmured, as if afraid to wake a secret. He pressed an ear to the cold metal. Beneath the distant hush of waves, he thought he caught the faintest sound. The whisper of fabric shifting, or something small brushing against steel. Too slight to be sure, yet enough to chill the back of his neck. He motioned for Harris, who was working the next row, to join him. Harris came with a high-powered flashlight and a lock-breaching kit. When the beam sliced into the gap, dust and fine mist drifted like motes in the air, catching the light. From within, a thin draft pushed out the scent of damp timber, old cloth, and something new, sharp enough to make Nico step closer. "Hold your position," Leo Harris cautioned, starting to work the latch. But before he could finish, Nico lifted his head, eyes still locked on the crack, and gave a long, low growl. Deeper than his usual warning, a sound from deep in his chest, resonant and unwavering. Leo knew exactly what it meant. Whatever was inside had triggered Nico's highest alert. He signaled Harris to stop. Both men stepped back, leaving space for the dog to move in. Nico inhaled deeply once more, then edged to the left side of the container nose, tracing the steel as if following an invisible thread of scent. At the rear corner, where the light barely reached, Leo saw several fresh scratches in the metal, unlike the long-aged rust scars. Some still bore flecks of different paint, perhaps from a hard object dragged or struck there recently. "Fresh marks," Leo said quietly, eyes fixed. "Someone's opened this not long ago," Harris nodded, noting the spot. Meanwhile, Nico returned to the front gaze, never leaving the doors. With years of experience, Leo knew that ignoring this reaction could mean losing a vital lead. He made the call. "We come back with full gear and more backup. Opening this without proper prep could be dangerous." Nico kept his eyes on the doors, even as Leo tugged gently at the lead, as if committing the sight and scent to memory. His steps away were slower than usual, still watchful, head turning until the weathered blue-green container disappeared into the fog. On the way back to the station, a tight knot of thought pressed in on Leo. He couldn't explain it with logic, but his instincts told him that what lay behind that door was no forgotten object. It carried the breath of an untold story, one that could very well be tied directly to the missing children. The air seemed heavier as they left the harbor, yet Nico's warning stare stayed vivid in Leo's mind, a reminder that they'd brushed against the edge of something far larger. By late afternoon, the fog had thinned, revealing the faded line of containers like silent steel monoliths along the water's edge. The sea wind cut in sharp, carrying salt and cold that seeped through to the bone. Leo returned with Nico and a fully equipped support team. Harris McKenna and 2 rescue workers armed with radios, high-powered flashlights, and lock-breaking tools. As they neared the weathered blue-green container Nico had marked the day before, everyone felt it. An atmosphere unlike the usual stillness of an abandoned dock. It was a silence stretched tight like a drawn wire, making each step feel weighted. Nico led his warm golden-brown coat glowing under the group's amber lights. He stopped directly before the container. Ears pricked, head tilted as though listening. Leo was about to signal Harris to begin unlocking when it came. a sound faint but undeniable from inside. At first they thought it was just metal contracting in the cold, but when they all held their breath, it came again. Sharper now. A short, hollow clink like something small striking the steel wall. Then silence. Every gaze turned to Leo. He raised a hand for stillness. In the complete quiet, a new pattern of sound emerged. 3 deliberate knocks evenly spaced, followed by something else. Soft but unmistakable, the muffled sob of a child. Harris tightened his grip on his flashlight, McKenna's breath caught in a short rush. No words were needed. They all understood. Someone was inside. "This is the Windmere rescue team," Leo called, pressing close to the steel voice, low but carrying. "If you can hear me, knock 3 times. Seconds later, 3 weak taps answered. Leo's chest tightened. He turned to the others and gave a firm nod. "Open it." McKenna and Harris moved instantly, crowbars biting into rusted seams. Nico shifted to the side, eyes fixed on the narrow gap body, angled forward in readiness. As the tools pried, the knocking came again. Faster now, joined by muffled sniffles and the overlapping voices of several children calling out. The sound pierced through the steel, trembling but alive, urging the team on. The hinges screamed, flakes of rust dropping to the ground. At last the door yielded enough for light to spill inside. A wave of stale, damp air rolled out, thick with the scent of sweat, old fabric, and long-trapped moisture. Leo shone his light in. Small faces appeared in the beam, pale from the cold and darkness, eyes wide blinking against the sudden glare. Some clung to each other, others to worn jackets or thin blankets, all staring out as if searching for proof that they were truly safe. "We're here to take you out," Leo said, his voice warm and certain. Nico stepped forward, lowering his head, his gaze softening. The smallest girl hair, tangled into knotted strands, reached out a trembling hand. Nico moved close, letting her touch his thick, warm fur. The gesture seemed to unlock something. Other children began to stir, inching toward the doorway. McKenna and Harris lifted them out one by one, wrapping each in blankets to fight the cold. Leo watched their eyes change, fear giving way to surprise, and then to a flicker of hope, especially when they noticed Nico close by, never letting them out of sight. When the last child was carried out, Leo stepped inside to check. The cramped space held old wooden crates, steel walls scarred with scratches and dents. In places, faint carvings marked the surface, desperate attempts to leave a sign. He photographed everything before stepping back out. Under the amber glow of the harbor lights, the rescued children sat huddled in their blankets, the turning point clear. No more blind searching. Now, they knew the children were alive, and that knowledge would strengthen the whole town. Nico stayed beside them, but his eyes still tracked the container row as though sensing the story wasn't over. In that gaze, Leo saw it too. The rescue had only begun, and larger questions waited ahead. The harbor's yellow light stretched their shadows long and distorted over the damp ground. Leo was checking the children's condition when he noticed Nico had left his side. The shepherd stood rigid, ears forward, eyes locked on a dark gap between 2 container rows in the distance. His amber coat bristled faintly along the spine. His breathing was slow, deep, a sign he'd caught a threat close by. From the heavy fog, shapes emerged. 3, then 4, then 5 men, all in dark clothing, hoods pulled low. Their steps were sure, their formation spreading as if to surround. In the dim light, a few carried lengths of metal pipe and other hard tools that caught a glint. Harris swore under his breath and stepped forward, placing himself between the men and the children. McKenna motioned for the other rescuers to move the kids deeper into a safer zone behind another row of containers. Leo kept his eyes fixed on the approaching figures, angling his body to hold ground between them and the children. Nico moved with him, low and silent, each step measured. His stare was ice cold, Not reckless aggression, but razor focus ready to react the moment any one of the intruders crossed the line. The gap closed to less than 10 meters. The man in the center halted, his voice low and rough. "You, get out of here. That container isn't yours." Leo met his eyes, his own voice calm, but each word weighted like stone. There were children inside. Now they're safe. You might want to think very carefully about your next words. The others shifted subtly, forming a loose half circle. One on the left swung a metal pipe so it scraped the ground, the sharp metallic ring cutting through the fog. He smirked, his eyes full of challenge. The air thickened. The distant waves seemed to fall away, leaving only the hiss of wind between the containers and the steady breathing of Nico. Leo knew that a single wrong move could turn the standoff into chaos. Harris quietly adjusted his position, keeping himself between the children and the threat, while leaving a clear route for a fast retreat if needed. McKenna's hand hovered near his radio, ready to call for backup. A slight step forward from the man in the center triggered Nico instantly. He slid half a stride ahead of Leo, pause, braced, head lowered, just enough eyes locked on target. It was a clear warning, one more step and there would be consequences. The man hesitated, but didn't back down. In that pause, Leo seized the moment, his voice low and iron hard. "You're standing on Windmere Harbor property at the site of a child abduction investigation. From this moment, any move you make will be treated as obstruction of a rescue operation." The words cut through the fog like a cold blade. A few of the men glanced at each other, hesitation flickering in their faces. But the one with the pipe stepped in, half a pace, grip tightening, his dry laugh breaking the stillness. Nico gave a short, deep growl, the kind that carried weight. Not noise, but a promise. The wind rose, bringing the bite of salt and cold, the tension strung as taut as a fraying wire. Then from the distance, a siren split the air, long, sharp, drawing closer. Patrol lights swept in streaks across the fog. The group stiffened. A few stepped back by instinct. The leader glanced toward the approaching lights, voice low and edged. "We'll meet again." They retreated as quickly as they'd come, their shapes dissolving into the mist, leaving behind a chill and the metallic tang of threat. Leo kept his stance, eyes on the direction they vanished, until the patrol's beam cut across the row and the danger finally ebbed. Harris exhaled hard. McKenna relayed a clipped update into his radio. The children were moved further back, still shaken but steadying, when Nico returned to their side. Leo knew this encounter was only an opening move. The men in the fog were connected to the disappearances, and now they knew exactly who stood in their way. The harbor air stayed cold, but inside Leo the fire burned hotter than ever. As the siren faded, the docks seemed to settle back into stillness. The rescue crew began gathering supplies, preparing to move the children, when a sharp metallic crash rang from the far side of the container yard, a sound that cracked through the mist like dry thunder. Leo spun toward it, heart hammering, just in time to see a dark figure slip out of sight behind a row of containers. A small gray canister rolled across the wet ground, tapping to a stop against the weathered blue-green container they had opened earlier. A second later, thick white smoke poured out, streaming through the door's gap like poisonous silk. "Smoke canister. Move now." Harris shouted, his voice bouncing off the steel walls. The haze spread fast, acrid fumes biting at the throat and stinging the eyes. The children coughed violently, their vision blurring. McKenna wrapped blankets around them, guiding them toward safety. Those too weak to walk were carried straight toward the ambulances. Nico shot forward like wind, planting himself in the container's doorway. He peered into the gloom, his gaze sweeping the corners. Leo understood immediately. There were still objects, traces, maybe even someone left inside, and the smoke was meant to erase it all. Wrapping a thin cloth over his mouth, Leo pushed in after him. Inside, the smoke clung, heavy shapes reduced to faint outlines, Crates, rusted tools, steel walls. The stench of burning chemicals mixed with damp rot and metal clawing at his lungs. His flashlight beam cut across the floor. The scratches he'd noticed before were hazy in the swirl. But in the far corner, something caught the light. A broken half of a child's blue plastic necklace. He grabbed it and sealed it in an evidence bag. Outside, Harris and McKenna had set up portable fans, widening openings for the sea wind to flush the smoke. It thinned but still curled around their ankles like a stubborn fog. Nico kept pacing the perimeter, amber eyes scanning for any return. Suddenly, running footsteps pounded from behind. Leo turned, catching only the silhouette of a fleeing figure disappearing between the rows, muddy footprints streaking the ground. Harris suspect heading west. Leo barked, pointing. Harris relayed instantly to the patrol closing in. But the children's safety still came first. McKenna's voice cut in, urgent. All kids are at the ambulances. Some need respiratory checks now. Leo nodded and called Nico over. The shepherd fell in beside him, matching his stride. They emerged from the haze together, breath ragged, but eyes alight with resolve. Whoever threw that smoke hadn't just tried to destroy evidence. They'd sent a warning. Before leaving the harbor, Leo looked back at the blue-green container one last time. The smoke had mostly cleared, but the image of it spilling in thick coils through the steel door was burned into his memory. A reminder that even a heartbeat's lapse could push everything back to the start. Beside him, Nico lifted his head to the wind ears, twitching. In his gaze, Leo read the truth plain as day. This fight was far from over, and the next steps would be even more dangerous. The sea wind whistled through the gaps between the shipping containers, carrying with it the faint, acrid smell of smoke. The docks had become a shadowy maze where the yellow glow from tall lampposts only carved out narrow paths of light. And beyond that lay a thick, impenetrable darkness. Leo had barely stepped out of the smoky haze when Nico's ears shot upright, his whole body tensing like a drawn bowstring. In an instant, the amber-coated German shepherd snapped his head toward the west, where the silhouette of the man who had thrown the smoke canister had just vanished, and launched forward like a streak of lightning. The rapid rhythm of claws striking metal echoed through the air, syncing with the rising tempo of Leo's heartbeat. Through the narrow gap between two rows of containers, the beam of a flashlight caught a tense scene. Nico was already on the target's heels, a man dressed head to toe in dark clothing. The man spun, ready to hurl another object, but the shepherd's powerful body slammed him hard against the steel wall. The crash rang sharp and metallic, leaving him dazed and stumbling. With the full weight of his frame, Nico pinned the man to the ground, white teeth flashing under the light as he clamped down on the hand clutching the second smoke canister. The man twisted in panic, but each movement only tightened the shepherd's hold. The canister rolled free, clinking across the ground, until it stopped right by Leo's boots. Seizing the moment, Leo scooped it up and hurled it out of the danger zone, then advanced toward another figure emerging from a junction between containers. A second man, larger and more muscular, gripping a length of steel pipe. He strode forward with aggression, but Leo was ready. In a heartbeat, he dropped his weight, driving his shoulder into the man's midsection, knocking him off balance and sending him crashing into a stack of wooden crates. The pipe hit the ground with a metallic clang. The man tried to recover, but Leo's arm hooked around his, twisting it in a practiced motion that forced him face down onto the cold metal floor. Under the golden light, Leo's eyes reflected both unshakable focus and the hardened skill of someone who had spent years in rescue and danger. Meanwhile, Nico held the first suspect firmly, his gaze locked and his stance unyielding. Every so often, a low, steady growl rumbled from his chest, a sound that stripped away any thought of resistance. Harris and McKenna, drawn by the noise, sprinted into view, each securing one suspect. Harris restrained the first man with a rescue zip tie, while McKenna snapped handcuffs onto the second. "Clear." Harris reported, his voice raspy from the run. Leo eased his shoulders, but his eyes swept the shadows for any hidden threats. He gave Nico a light pat on the shoulder, a wordless praise. The shepherd lifted his head, panting amber eyes glinting with quiet satisfaction at having protected his team and neutralized the immediate threat. When the patrol officers arrived to take custody, Leo quickly relayed what had happened. One officer examined the smoke canister, confirming it was industrial grade, capable of causing suffocation in enclosed spaces. That detail only deepened Leo's certainty this was no random act of vandalism. Nico stayed close, watching as the two suspects were led away, his tail giving a faint wag when Leo's hand rested on his neck, though his alert stance never fully faded. The air at the docks was still taut with tension, but Leo knew they had gained a critical advantage. These men might be the link that could lead them to the heart of the kidnapping network. And thanks to Nico's lightning-fast takedown, they had prevented a move that could have wiped out every trace they needed. On the damp ground, the muddy prints of the fleeing suspects still trailed westward. Leo knew that was the direction they would have to follow next. Suddenly, the piercing shriek of a metal cutter tore through the mist-heavy air. Sparks erupted in a shower, dancing like fragments of fallen stars against the wet concrete. The rescue team stood in a half-circle, eyes fixed on the lock being sliced apart, its rusted frame giving way inch by inch. Leo's grip tightened on Nico's harness. The shepherd stood solidly at his side, breathing slow and steady, amber eyes locked on the weathered container door ahead. From inside came faint noises, weak shuffling, muffled sobs that threaded themselves between the whine of the cutter, stretching every second unbearably long. "Almost there," Harris called, his voice carrying over the grinding machine. The final hinge gave and Harris wrenched the door open. A cloud of thick white smoke spilled out, instantly curling into the air like a cold phantom. Everyone instinctively stepped back. McKenna and two rescuers donned respirators, flashlights in hand, and stepped inside. Light cut through the haze, revealing small, dirt-smudged faces. 15 children huddled together, some trembling wide-eyed at the sudden glare and the sight of rescuers. A girl of about 8 shielded her eyes, then burst into sobs when McKenna's warm hand touched her shoulder. "We're here to take you home," McKenna murmured, voice gentle as a lullaby. Leo moved in to help, lifting a frail boy whose pale lips trembled as if trying to form words. Holding him close, Leo felt the faint but steady rhythm of his breathing before passing him into the care of waiting medics. Nico walked alongside occasionally, lowering his head to sniff each child as if personally confirming their safety. When the last child, a little girl, was carried out, relief rippled through the dock. Some parents had already arrived, rushing forward with cries and tearful embraces. The air was filled with the sound of names being called, voices breaking, and sobs of pure relief. Leo stepped back slightly, taking in the scene. A boy, hair tousled and face dusty, still shaking in a medic's arms, suddenly turned toward Nico. Their eyes met, and the boy's lips curved into the faintest smile before he stretched out a hand. Nico approached, slowly lowering his head until the boy's fingers brushed his warm fur. In that moment, the boy's eyes lit with a fragile spark, like finding a safe corner in the midst of a nightmare. McKenna came up beside Leo, giving his shoulder a firm pat. "We made it in time. Any later, and the smoke could have made this so much worse." Leo nodded, but inside the relief was tangled with an unshakable drive to uncover the ones pulling the strings. What had unfolded at the harbor was only the tip of an iceberg. From afar, the red and blue strobes of ambulances and police cruisers lit the misty sky. The children were ushered onto the vehicles, wrapped in warm blankets, given water and small snacks. Their faces, moments ago tight with fear, now softened. Hope replacing panic as their eyes searched for loved ones or clung to the sight of the rescuers. Nico stood at the edge of the pier, watching until the ambulance doors closed. Leo stepped beside him, gently ruffling his fur. "Well done, my friend." The air at the harbor still carried a trace of smoke, yet the silence of before had given way to laughter and voices calling names. And though everyone there knew this story was far from over, the instant that container door had burst open would forever remain, etched as a moment when courage, teamwork, and sheer perseverance rekindled hope for an entire town. The ambulance sirens cut through the night fog that shrouded the coastal town. The convoy rolled away from the pier carrying 15 rescued children. Red and blue lights swept along the narrow streets, flashing across windows like the steady heartbeat of a community holding its breath. In the back of one ambulance, Leo sat with Nico and 2 small children swaddled in thick navy blankets. A little boy leaned against Leo's shoulder, eyes heavy with exhaustion, yet his small hand clung to the officer's wrist, as if afraid this fragile safety might slip away. Nico lay pressed against their legs, his amber gaze calm, his slow, steady breathing radiating a sense of security that even the adults felt. At the hospital, bright white light from the emergency ward spilled into the night. Medics and volunteers surged forward swiftly, taking each child into their care. The scene brimmed with emotion. Names shouted sighs of relief, muffled sobs blending into the hum of activity. A mother rushed in, clutching her daughter so tightly, her hands trembled as if loosening her grip would cause the girl to vanish. The father beside her, eyes red-rimmed, nodded over and over in gratitude, his palm brushing gently over his daughter's hair as he whispered comfort. Just steps away, another couple gathered their son into their arms, tears falling onto the blanket wrapped around him. Their smiles carried both joy and a staggering sense of relief. Leo stood back watching. He saw the embraces that refused to loosen, the faces lit in the midst of a long night, and he knew this was the truest reward for every ounce of effort the moment families were made whole again. Nico stayed close, earning pats on the head and murmured thanks. A young boy, eyes still wide with leftover fear, stepped forward and placed his hand on the shepherd's head. Feeling the warmth beneath his palm, the boy's lips curved into a small smile, a smile that spread and brightened his pale face. In the waiting area, McKenna handed out cups of hot tea to each family. The steam, the warmth, and the quiet presence of those around made the place feel almost like a single home that had just weathered a storm. Some of the children began whispering fragments of their ordeal. They'd heard someone calling their names, seen a shaft of light slip through a crack in the door, felt the warmth of the hand that pulled them from the darkness. Leo sank into a chair slowly, pulling off his gloves, eyes drawn to the window where light rain brushed against the glass. His muscles ached, but his heart felt full. The images of those eyes, those smiles, and those tears of release, he would carry them always. The attending physician approached, shaking his hand. "You brought a miracle to this night." Leo only nodded, glancing down at Nico resting quietly by his boots. He knew it was this amber-coated shepherd who had truly unlocked that miracle. Outside, the sky was still dark, but every hospital window glowed like a beacon of safety. And in the mingled laughter and tears, the town of Windmere knew they had reclaimed the most precious thing. Small lives, still growing hearts, now wrapped in love. By morning, a weak sun filtered through Windmere's thinning fog. But inside the police station, the air was heavy with case files, crime scene photos, and the hum of urgent discussion. On the long table in the meeting room, a map of the harbor lay spread out, pinned with yellow and red tags. Leo sat in one corner with Nico at his side, listening as the investigation team reported. Surveillance footage from around the harbor had been pulled. In the grainy night images, silver-gray trucks crept toward an abandoned container yard. Faces hid beneath hoods and masks, but a few frames were clear enough for the tech team to match them to known offenders, with histories tied to child trafficking in nearby coastal towns. Sergeant Harris tapped a photo. Jonah Keller, arrested in Fairmont for holding minors, released just 6 months ago. Next to him in another image stood a tall, lean man with a cold, sharp gaze. And this is Malcolm Price, prime suspect in last year's triple child disappearance in Claiborne. Not enough evidence to charge him then. But this time. Harris paused, his eyes sweeping the room. They left too much behind. Leo recalled the moment Nico intercepted the man with the smoke canister, the takedown by Harris and McKenna. That capture had been the thread that unraveled everything. In the interrogation room, the suspect's halting denials crumbled under the weight of evidence. Fingerprints on the canister mud matching their boots and the plastic collar Leo had found inside the container. From their confessions, police confirmed it was part of a multi-state trafficking ring targeting children in coastal towns and rural communities. They held them temporarily in containers or abandoned warehouses, waiting for the right moment to move them elsewhere. Windmere had been only a transit point in their network. When the news was quietly shared within the rescue team and police, it steeled everyone's resolve. No one said it out loud, but they all understood. Saving 15 children was only the beginning. There were still others out there waiting. McKenna placed a folder in front of Leo. You and Nico stumbled right into the most crucial link. Without the two of you, they might have erased every trace before we even knew where to look. Leo glanced down at Nico and smiled faintly. The dog tilted his head, amber eyes catching the room's light, silent, yet carrying an uncanny understanding of everything unfolding. That afternoon, the team moved toward a warehouse on the outskirts, identified as a secondary base for the group. The large red door was peeling the interior barren, except for a few torn cardboard boxes and fresh tire tracks. The sharp scent of machine oil still hung in the air, proof they had left only moments ago. Harris signaled the forensics unit to collect anything. Scraps of paper with phone numbers, flecks of paint stuck to a container wall. On the way back, Leo quietly studied the silver-gray sky of the setting sun. He knew this fight would be long, but at least part of the truth now lay exposed. The human trafficking network that had once seemed invisible was beginning to reveal its first weak links. And Windmere would no longer be a place for them to hide in the shadows. That evening at the harbor, the sound of waves folded into the calls of gulls above. Leo stood beside Nico, gazing out at a fog-blurred horizon. In the wind, he could almost hear a quiet promise that they would follow every trail until the perpetrators had nowhere left to run. By the next morning, Windmere felt as though it wore a new skin. The cobblestone streets, the porches dusted in mist, the salt-tinged breeze. Everything was the same, yet, in the eyes of its people, there was a new steadfastness. The rescue of the 15 children had stirred something deep, reminding everyone that safety wasn't solely the job of the police or rescue teams. It belonged to all of them. Inside the town hall, the wooden benches were filled long before the meeting began. The elderly, the young fishermen, shopkeepers, even high school students. All had come. Leo and Nico sat in the front row beside Mayor Cole and Sergeant Harris. Morning light streamed through the tall windows, falling across solemn faces. Mayor Cole rose first, his voice low but resonant. We've lived through days we'd rather forget, yet they've also been a wake-up call. The unity of Windmere is our strongest shield. Today, we strengthen that shield more than ever. Applause broke out. Not loud but steady like a vow. Harris outlined plans for increased night patrols, lookout posts along the harbor and forest edges, those blind spots in town security. Fishermen volunteered to mount extra floodlights along the shore. Shopkeepers promised to supply food and water for late-night shifts. A group of women proposed Bright Eyes, a phone and radio network to report suspicious activity instantly. High school students offered to run the town's social media, posting timely alerts. When Leo was invited to speak, he recounted the moment Nico found the container. The instant when instinct and persistence saved an entire group of children. Safety isn't just fences and locks. It's noticing the small things. A strange vehicle, a hurried figure, an unusual sound. Each of us can be the Nico of Windmere. As if understanding, Nico lifted his head, amber gaze sweeping the room, his tail giving a soft wag. A few children in the back smiled and waved at the sable-coated shepherd as though sending their thanks once more. When the meeting ended, no one left immediately. Small knots of people lingered, discussing specifics. Fishermen planned how to divide night watches between sea and shore. Shopkeepers jotted lists of supplies for stormy nights. An elderly carpenter offered to build warning signs for dangerous areas. By late afternoon, Leo joined several volunteers to walk the coastline. The blue-gray water caught the fading light as waves broke against the rocks. Nico trotted ahead, stopping now and then to sniff the air, occasionally glancing back at Leo as if to confirm all was well. The sight made a boy walking with them whisper, "I want a dog like Nico one day to help protect where I live." Leo smiled, resting a hand on the boy's shoulder. The most important thing isn't having a dog. It's having a heart that protects. By sunset, the entire town seemed ready for a new chapter, one where every door, every light, every watchful eye would guard their peace. And in the rhythm of the waves, Windmere seemed to whisper to itself it would not let the darkness return. That night, an unusual stillness lay over the town. Sea air drifted through narrow lanes, carrying the clean tang of salt, mixed with the faint scent of weathered wood. The full moon poured silver over the long stretch of beach beyond the town, where waves rolled in like the steady breath of someone deep in sleep. Leo chose that beach for tonight. He wanted to step away from the meeting's voices, the hum of plans and promises, just for a moment, to sit with his companion and say what the past days had left unsaid. Nico walked beside him, paws soundless over the sand, moving in rhythm with the tide. When Leo sat on a broad stone, the shepherd immediately settled at his feet, head resting on his knee, eyes lifted in quiet expectation. In the moonlight, every strand of his golden sable fur glowed with a warm sheen against the cool, pale sand. Leo's hand moved gently along the firm, strong line of Nico's back. Beneath his palm was warmth and solidity, the very thing that had anchored him through the most tense moments of his life. He remembered their first meeting on a winter morning at the K9 rescue training ground. Back then, the young German shepherd still carried the raw energy of the wild, his amber eyes bright and brimming with curiosity. But from the instant Leo reached out his hand, Nico had stepped forward without the slightest hesitation. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Leo murmured, his voice blending with the whisper of the wind. The days replayed in his mind like slow, vivid reels. The misty morning when the first news of missing children swept through town. Hours spent searching the forest under relentless rain, the thick smell of smoke spilling from the shipping container, and that single moment when Nico placed himself between Leo and danger, his eyes blazing with resolve. Every memory was colored with sights, scents, and the unshakable image of a golden amber figure who always advanced without fear. Nico tilted his head, brushing lightly against Leo's hand, as if he understood the story was about him. "Thank you," Leo said, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. "Thank you for being there when everything felt like it was slipping away. Thank you for believing in something I wasn't even sure of myself." A wave crashed against the shore, sending a spray of silver droplets into the moonlight. Leo felt the cold touch of seawater around his feet. Yet an indescribable warmth filled his chest. In that moment, he wasn't a police officer, nor a member of the rescue unit. He was simply a man grateful to a friend who had shared everything with him, from peaceful silences to the brink of life and death. Far off, the lighthouse bell rang low and deep like a gentle goodnight whispered to the sea. Leo looked toward it, then back down at Nico, who sat patiently by his side. A quiet laugh escaped him, soft as a breath. Maybe without you, Windmere wouldn't be awake the way it is today. Nico gave a single wag of his tail, then rested his head on the sand, eyes half closed, but ears still tuned to every sound. That night, the two silhouettes, man and dog, remained side by side for a long time. No more words were needed. Everything had been spoken in the days they had walked together through mist, rain, and fear. And there, where the sea touched the sky, that silent thank you would remain forever, an invisible thread tying them together, no matter where the road might lead. The next morning, Windmere's sky was an impossible shade of blue. Clouds drifted slowly above, as though they too wanted to linger for the day's significance. The town square had been dressed in flags and blue ribbons, the color of loyalty and trust. People had gathered early, filling the air with a mix of reverence and anticipation, all waiting to honor those who had saved 15 small lives. Leo stood just outside the row of seats reserved for guests of honor. His uniform crisp, but his eyes kept straying downward to where Nico sat alert beside him. The German shepherd's amber coat gleamed in the sunlight, his ears pricked, scanning the crowd with calm vigilance. When the loudspeaker came to life, Mayor Cole stepped onto the podium. His voice was warm, yet carried steel in its emphasis. Today, we honor courage, devotion, and an unyielding spirit. We are grateful to those who turned despair into hope, who brought light into darkness. He called Leo's name. Applause burst across the square, some rising to their feet in respect. Leo shook the mayor's hand, accepted the framed commendation with a steady gaze. Then the mayor smiled and said, "And now we welcome rescue dog Nico, the pride of Windmere." The square erupted. Cheers, whistles, and children's voices calling Nico's name filled the air. Leo bent slightly, signaling, and Nico stepped forward. Each stride was deliberate, the silver collar at his neck catching flashes of sunlight. Harris approached with sure hands, fastening a small star-shaped medal on a blue ribbon around Nico's neck. The medal glinted brightly against his coat. Nico stood still, head slightly tilted, eyes wide, as he took in the faces before him. And then came the moment that stilled the entire crowd. Nico lifted his head high, his gaze proud yet gentle. In those eyes they saw the alertness of a guardian, the warmth of a companion, and the endurance of a warrior who had faced the most grueling hours and emerged with his kindness intact. A little girl, one of the rescued children, stepped onto the stage clutching a small bouquet. Hesitant at first, she knelt before Nico and set the flowers at his strong paws. Nico lowered his head and touched his nose to her hand. The crowd seemed to melt all at once. Mayor Cole's voice trembled slightly. "This medal is not only for bravery, but for the friendship and trust Nico has planted in our hearts. Let this image remind us that sometimes heroes don't need words, only a look." The applause swelled again, mingling with the sound of waves from the distant shore. Leo, standing beside Nico, ran his hand down that familiar back. Pride filled him, wordless and absolute. He knew that whatever the days ahead might bring, this moment would live forever in the town's memory. When the ceremony ended, people gathered to take photos with Leo and Nico. Children wrapped their arms around the dog's neck. Adults shook Leo's hand, their eyes shining with renewed faith. As they left the square, Nico glanced back, his ears flicking in the wind, listening perhaps to the heartbeat of a community now moving together. That evening, the sea breeze carried a different scent, softer, cooler, and peaceful. After weeks of urgency, Windmere finally breathed in a rare stillness. Along the stone-paved street by the water, the rush of footsteps had given way to the steady rhythm of waves and the distant cry of gulls. Leo's small home sat on a slope facing the bay. The last light of day poured through the wide window, laying warm golden trails across the wooden floor. In the quiet room, Nico lay curled on the rug by the window, the medal from the ceremony hanging neatly on the wall, glinting gently as if it held the day's gratitude in its shine. Nico's amber coat glowed as the late afternoon sun slipped across it. His eyes half-lidded, yet focused on some far-off point beyond the waves, carried a calm that seemed to belong to another time. A gentle breeze drifted in through the open window, ruffling the fur around his neck, bringing with it the salt of the sea and a faint trace of timber from a ship anchored offshore. At the nearby table, Leo set down a cup of steaming tea and simply watched. In Nico's posture, there was a rare and precious ease, as if the greatest reward for all he had done was the peace now shared by an entire community. The memories remained vivid in Leo's mind, the faded green container by the harbor, the faint knocks from within the sudden rush of white smoke, and the image of Nico surging forward fearless in the face of danger. No words of thanks could ever truly hold the weight of what this dog had given. A stronger gust stirred the room. Nico lifted his head ears high, an alert gaze fixed on some distant point at sea. In that moment, Leo was reminded that the instincts of a guardian never left him, not even in the quietest hours. Smiling faintly, he stepped closer and sat beside him, letting his hand rest gently along Nico's back. The dog turned to meet his eyes, and in that amber gaze was absolute trust, an unspoken bond that needed no language to be understood. Outside, the sun brushed the horizon, leaving behind a ribbon of orange and violet across the water. White-capped waves caught the glow, turning the sea into a living canvas. Leo knew this calm might not last forever. There would be other trials, other urgent calls, and someday he and Nico would walk out that door again to protect what they loved. But today he chose to hold on to this moment. When Windmere's silent hero lay quietly by the window, listening to the sea, letting the evening breeze thread through his amber fur. A simple yet profound emblem of safety's return. Somewhere out there, long roads still awaited their footprints, new missions waited to be answered. But until that call came, Nico would remain here guarding the town with nothing more than his steady, silent presence. And as the sunset folded into night, Windmere surrendered to a peaceful sleep, knowing that when the next dawn brought new challenges, their hero, a silent hero, would still be right there beside them. The story of Leo and Nico closed here, but its echo lingered in every street and under every roof in Windmere. It was more than a rescue. It was proof of the strength of friendship, loyalty, and steadfast courage a German shepherd can give. Nico showed us that sometimes a hero doesn't wear armor or stand beneath bright lights. A hero can be the sharp eyes that cut through the fog, the unyielding stride toward danger, and the quiet presence that makes people feel safe. The German shepherd, intelligent, resolute, and warm-hearted, reminds us of the unique bond between humans and animals. They are not just pets. They are family partners and friends willing to place our lives above their own. From this story, may we all cherish the moments we share with our four-legged companions. Give them care, affection, and time. For the love they offer is always whole and without condition. And if one day you see a German shepherd standing still, eyes fixed on something unseen, know that in that moment, the heart of a guardian is beating fiercely for you. So love them, value them, and protect them, just as they quietly protect us every single day.